With promises of free treatment for bad blood, the doctors recruited 400 men never before treated, and now in the later stages of syphilis. Much was already known about the natural history of this disease. Syphilis is most contagious in the first weeks and months and is spread sexually and congenitally from mother to fetus. In its early stages, rashes, headaches, fevers, and pain are common. Then syphilis enters a symptomless latency period which lasts from months to decades, and for a lucky minority, never ends. But for the majority, there will be a relapse, the violent storm of late syphilis. Now the disease attacks the brain, internal organs, and joints of its most unfortunate victims. As the Tuskegee study began, the government doctors cataloged the effects of latent and late syphilis. They conducted blood tests, detailed physical exams, and x-rays. And there was one more test they wanted, a purely diagnostic spinal tap to determine the prevalence of neurological syphilis.
I'm going to locate that spot between the vertebrae in your lower back and make a small needle puncture there to withdraw some fluid. Not much to it, really.
Good.
Bend your head over. Further. Further, I said. Good. Good. Now you're going to have to sit very still. Miss Evers will help you. Especially once that needle is inside your spinal canal. Don't move, or that needle might injure the nerves in your legs.
But to my legs?
That's right. That's why we don't want you to move.
Don't worry, I'm not moving.
All right. Here we go.
You're going too far.
I have to try to find the spinal canal. All right. Here we go.
That was pretty bad, that spinal tap, because I did along pretty good with it, but, I stayed in the bed a week or two.
This letter, sent to each man before his spinal tap, claimed it was a very special free treatment.
Some time ago, you were given a thorough examination. And since that time, we hope you have gotten a great deal of treatment for bad blood. You will now be given your last chance to get a second examination. This examination is a very special one, and after it is finished, you will be given a special treatment if it is believed
you are in a condition to stand it. Remember, this is your last chance for a special free treatment.
The men were told that the spinal taps were a treatment. That shows you some of the deception and deceit involved in the study. And these are physicians saying this, so that it has a certain power and authority of physicians saying this.
Men from this community were told that the government doctors had come to help them. They were never informed of the real purpose of the research project. They were never told the true nature of their illness, nor the dangers they faced. According to the original proposal, the Tuskegee study was to be finished at the end of 6 months. Instead, it was just beginning. Government doctors became fascinated by their early data. They saw indications that blacks suffered the same complications from syphilis as whites. That was exciting because it contradicted the prevailing wisdom that somehow syphilis was different and less deadly among blacks. The investigators convinced themselves that their research could answer other more general questions as well. In their mind, they thought they could break new scientific ground in the study of syphilis. Their excitement propelled them forward, as the Tuskegee study was poised to make its most fateful turn. Raymond Vandeleer, a young field officer, now played a critical role. Particularly enthralled by the science and blatantly unconcerned for the welfare of the men, he pushed to extend this study into a long-term, open-ended research project. Soon, Vandeleer was promoted to the head of the VD division and had the power himself to implement his plan. Now preparing for the long-term study, the Public Health Service hired a Tuskegee nurse, Eunice Rivers, the inspiration for Miss Evers in the play. Rivers was to become the main liaison between Macon County and Washington, driving the back roads of rural Alabama to monitor the subjects and tend to their minor complaints. She traveled to country fairs and churches and schools to maintain contact with the men and their families. She also helped to recruit a group of controls, 200 men free of the disease. But Rivers' main responsibility was to gather the study participants for the now annual roundups when the government doctors came to town. On each subject they performed physicals and blood tests, and to maintain the appearance of treatment, the doctors gave the men placebos, vitamins, aspirins, and tonics, all useless against syphilis.
We got 3 different types of medicine. We got a little round pill, and sometimes they give us a capsule, and then they would give us a little vial of liquid medicine. Everybody got the same thing.
These were men who weren't going to question the system, who weren't going to question the government doctors, who weren't going to be out there picketing and writing and protesting about it. These were men in Macon County, Alabama. Who's going to speak for them?
In the 1930s, throughout the South, legally enforced segregation maintained a system of racial hierarchy. Black people were expected to live in deference to white authority. When some of the men of the study were ordered by their employers to go for blood testing, they had little choice but to comply. The Public Health Service continued to rely upon that authority.
Nurse Evers.
In Miss Evers' Boys, the nurse is based on Eunice Rivers, and the character of Dr. Douglas represents Vandalier and the medical establishment.
Not to treat these men by mistake. This is the decision Washington has made. This study must go to endpoint.
And how far is that?
Autopsy.
Autopsy.
The facts in this study must be validated by autopsy. We're so close to unraveling.
And the Public Health Service wasn't above a bit of bribery.
Those men need our help, don't they?
Of course they do.
Would $50 be of help to those men?
$50 is a lot of money in Macon County, Dr. Douglas.
Would $50 life insurance convince those men to stay with this study?
Life insurance?
For burial.
A decent burial would mean a lot to those men. They're buried in feed sacks by the city dump.
As long as this study continues, any study patient who dies, for whatever reason, receives $50 life insurance. Washington would do that, Nurse Evers, if it would help.
In the earlier years, they gave even less.
My father-in-law was in this study, and he died early, and they gave him $35 in his burial, and that was almost burial person in those days. In fact, it would. It gave you a casket, pretty decent burial.
In exchange, bodies were taken to a local hospital for postmortems. Tuskegee nurse Mary Harper assisted.
We would to start off, with the autopsy, and Dr. Peters was saying, my God, it is interesting for when we saw a great deal of the spread and the devastating effect that the syphilis had on the body. He was saying, you know what, Mary, pull the clinical record for this particular patient, and we want to see to what extent does his clinical manifestation match the amount of pathology that we had found in the body. That was the thing that was very, very interesting.
As the records indicate, the autopsies sometimes revealed even more damage inside the bodies than had been expected from previous physical exams.
Once you start looking down in that body and looking at the various organs and the effects that it had, then you know it is a very, very devastating illness.
The very first autopsy was performed at the end of 1933. Over the years, many deaths were to follow this one, each dutifully noted in government reports and scientific papers.
The Tuskegee study was almost never a secret from its very inception. And one of the most interesting and difficult aspects to account for it is the fact that periodically, starting in 1936 and then on a fairly regular basis, the results of the study's findings were reported in major medical journals.
In the early years, the findings were sometimes also reported to Congress, but no one inside the medical establishment or government questioned the merits of the study.
This was not some mad scientists in the basement doing this. That it was public information. And I think people did not raise issues about it because they didn't see anything wrong with it. The medical profession did not see anything wrong with it.
The first article was published in 1936 in the Journal of the American Medical Association. The researchers reported that of their 400 subjects, 75% suffered some complications of late syphilis. Half showed cardiovascular damage, and a third had neurological symptoms. The scientists continued to find the data intriguing, and they watched and waited to see what would happen next to the men of the study. By 1937, conditions in Macon County were looking up. During a New Deal sweep through the South, FDR brought his message of hope to Tuskegee.
We're realizing more and more that it's a great privilege to be alive. Somebody said it's grand, no matter how old you get, to want to keep on living because there's still so much to be done.
As part of the program of national recovery, the government reasserted its public health initiatives. The Public Health Service launched a revived nationwide campaign to combat the syphilis epidemic. It was run by the principal architect of the Tuskegee study, Raymond Vandeleer.
The physician who accepts for treatment a patient with syphilis assumes a very definite public obligation. When you accept a patient, you should likewise accept the responsibility of assuring yourself that he completes the treatment schedule.
By 1938, there was a National Venereal Disease Control Act, and throughout the nation, including Alabama, the Public Health Service pushed for syphilis treatment programs, but not for the men of Tuskegee. They were systematically excluded, and if they sought out help, they were tracked down and stopped. This happened to Herman Shaw when he went to Birmingham, Alabama for treatment.
When I got there, I saw a nurse pacing through the camp, talking about she was disturbed and thinking she'd been looking for someone that wasn't supposed to be there.
There are 2 patients in this treatment clinic who do not belong here. Is there a man here named Willie Johnson? Is there a man here named Caleb Humphreys?
Yes, I'm here. Over here, Nurse Evans. You wearing a new hat.
What are you doing here, Willie Johnson?
I said, what are you doing up here? I said, well, they told me I had to come up here. They said, sure, you got to go to Birmingham. So she said, come here, come here.
That doctor did not know you were a government patient. If that doctor had known that, he wouldn't have sent you here. Now you get back on that bus to Tuskegee.
And they gave me breakfast and put me on the bus and sent me back to town. I said, you didn't supposed to be here. I said, you're in Macon County Clinic.
One of the remarkable aspects of the study was the lengths to which the Public Health Service went to ensure that the men never received treatment. And when some of the men, by their own design, were able to obtain treatment, this was perceived by the researchers as abrogating the study.
The world was changing, spurred on by the Second World War. But single-mindedly, the researchers ignored or circumvented each change that threatened their study. After 1941, millions of Americans were swept into the armed forces. All of them were tested for disease, and those infected with syphilis were ordered to treatment. But in Tuskegee, the scientists running the study appealed to the draft board to exclude their subjects from military service, so their syphilis would remain untreated. Study subject Charles Pollard, however, was inducted into another type of service. When the U.S. government asked him to appear in this film to promote black support for the war effort, he agreed. Pollard and his wife played the proud parents of an Army pilot, a member of the famed Tuskegee Airmen. Charles Pollard was eligible for the draft during the war, but he was never called to duty. To the U.S. government, he and the other men of the study had their own special status. As the war raised the stakes, the Public Health Service escalated its campaign to rouse the national will against syphilis. This wartime propaganda took on a decidedly moralistic tone.
Search out the places that infect the city, that infect its people. The places with the easy pickups. This is where syphilis must be fought. Search out the people, too. The people who carry the disease.
And soon these campaigns were fortified by a revolutionary medical breakthrough. The war period saw the rise of a wonder drug, penicillin.
Recognition that penicillin effectively treated syphilis had remarkable implications immediately during the war for the treatment of syphilis among American troops, but beyond that was kind of a marker that, in fact, perhaps there would be magic bullets.
By now, John Heller had replaced Von der Leer as the director of the Tuskegee study.
More than 200,000 new infections of syphilis are acquired in this country each year. All are actually or potentially highly infectious.
On the basis of present evidence, penicillin appears to have great value in the treatment of syphilis in virtually all stages and manifestations.
Whatever the future may hold for penicillin therapy, we physicians already have in our hands weapons which, with proper medical usage, should enable us to reduce materially the amount of venereal disease in the United States.
While promoting penicillin for the nation, Heller continued the policy of denying treatment to the men in Macon County. In 1947, he published the latest findings from the study in the Journal of Venereal Disease Information.
The life expectancy of a Negro man between 25 and 50 who is infected with syphilis and receives no treatment is reduced by about 20%. The fact that nearly twice as large a proportion of the syphilitic individuals as of the control group has died is a very striking one.
Even with undisputed evidence that men were dying, no penicillin was offered. One of the few surviving public health service doctors who worked on the study still defends that decision, John Cutler.
It was important. They were supposedly untreated, and it would be undesirable to go ahead and use large amounts of penicillin to treat another disease because you'd interfere with the study.
The fact that the men are denied penicillin simply reaffirms how determined the Public Health Service is to keep this experiment going. I don't see it as a new issue. Having decided to withhold the treatment of choice in the 1930s, treatment that doctors in the 1930s said was good treatment, I don't think that there'd be any ethical dilemma for withholding penicillin when that presents itself. They'd already crossed that bridge.
If the ethics of the study had ever been unclear, the events of 1947 should have brought them into sharp focus.
Second Nuremberg trials. The American Military Tribunal hearing evidence against 23 of the leading Nazi doctors.
The Nuremberg tribunals uncovered, amid the perverse horrors of the Nazi regime, gross examples of human experimentation in the name of medical science. The trial of these Nazi doctors led the international community to formulate the Nuremberg Code for the Protection of Human Subjects. Its first and central principle was informed consent. Subjects must voluntarily agree to be part of any experiment and must be fully aware of all risks. The scientists of the Tuskegee study, including Director John Heller, dismissed the relevance of Nuremberg.
I asked him specifically about Nuremberg and whether that gave him any pause. And he said absolutely not. I asked him if whether he ever drew any associations between what they were doing and what the Nazis had done, and he said certainly not. And then he looked at me with a kind of wounded innocence and said they were Nazis.
The Nazi concentration camp experiments, because of their fiendish nature, were seen as an aberration, as something that could not happen anywhere else in the civilized world, and therefore it was relegated into a special category. But there were important lessons to be learned from Nuremberg, and those lessons were not learned.
And so the government doctors and Nurse Rivers continued their roadside roundups to observe but not treat the ever fewer survivors. Despite the many changes around them, the national campaign to treat syphilis, the advent of penicillin, the horrors exposed at Nuremberg, the researchers pushed on, undeterred. And soon there was yet another development to ignore.
It is ironic that in this county, where so much emphasis was being placed upon civil rights and the right to vote, that there could be a situation occurring that most people did not realize, where African American, rural Macon County, underprivileged, very little educated men were being taken advantage of by the federal government.
In the mid-50s, Fred Gray was an attorney for Martin Luther King at the center of the civil rights movement that exploded just 40 miles from Tuskegee in Montgomery, Alabama.
I don't even believe that the persons who started the study would have even considered using white persons instead of black. It was racially motivated, it was racially conceived. They found here a pocket of blacks who the nation really would care little or nothing about.
During the turbulent years of the civil rights movement in Alabama, the study went on. The scientists continued to ignore this new force that shook the world around them. Instead, they watched and they waited to see what would happen next to the men of the study. A decade later, in the mid-60s, the civil rights movement was in its prime, and the Tuskegee study was almost 40 years old.